Welcome to the Lean AI podcast, where we're flipping the AI conversation on its head by focusing on holistic strategies and tactics that drive AI adoption, rather than focusing solely on overcoming the technical challenges of AI. In every Season 1 episode of the Lean AI podcast, we talk with corporate AI leaders just like you, who have uncovered secrets of driving successful AI adoption with far less wasted time and investment. Our guests challenge established views and offer disruptive perspectives, providing new actionable insights. Welcome, everyone, to the Lean AI podcast. Today, we're excited to welcome Mike Schubert, a technology executive with over 25 years of experience in AI and digital transformation. As Vice President of Technology at Unum, Mike has been pivotal in modernizing the company's tech and customer experience with innovative AI strategies. He's got a background at Anthem, which is now Elevance Health, McKesson, HP, and Presidio. So he brings a wealth of knowledge in executing AI initiatives that actually drive real business value. So welcome, Mike. We're excited to have you on the show.
Thanks, Ben. I'm super happy to be here. It's probably a good point in time for me to say the views I express here are my own. They don't necessarily express any of those great places that I've worked in the past. A little bit about me. I am accountable for the technology that provides service after the sale at Unum. These are things like policy admin, payments, billing, et cetera. And it's a number of back office systems, as well as consumer and client-facing digital technology that supports our members when they've experienced a life event. So, I'm a software engineer at heart. I've had roles and personal interests surrounding machine learning and AI for over half my career, and really happy to be here and share some of those experiences with you and your audience.
We're glad to have you. So, Mike, about a month ago, we were both in Las Vegas attending the 2024 AI 4 conference, which had over 5,000 people, big conference, lots of different companies there. You gave a talk on succeeding with AI, how to select, execute, and measure your initiatives. Before we dive into the framework itself that you outlined in your presentation, why did you choose to present on that specific topic among all the other potential topics you could have presented on?
It's a great question. And it's one kind of rooted in the history of my career, where I've been fortunate to be a part of, or in some cases survive, a number of hype cycles, ranging from the dot-com boom and bust. There was this whole Web 2.0 thing with social networks and the Facebook revolution. There was a mobile first wave, then turned into the cloud first wave. And now I'm helping navigate my organization and others through the AI wave that has really captured public interest like no other segment of technology that I can recall. And I really felt like there was this need to communicate the need to ground ourselves in some of the basics of why we actually go about and try to tackle the problems we do, and then layer on AI or whatever the solution is on top of it. And I hope that's the message that really came across in my talk.
So, Mike, can you walk us through then the 4-step framework that you outlined in your presentation at the conference?
These 4 steps are really grounded from my perspective as a technology delivery executive. At the end of the day, I've got to be a steward of the dollars that are given to me in order to deliver a business outcome. And so these 4 steps are what really helped me and my team get to that end objective and deliver the value. And step 1 is really ensuring that we understand what the problem is that's being solved. What is it? Who's experiencing it? In what context of the overall value stream or workflow does the problem manifest itself? From there, we go into that second step of identifying what metrics are really associated with the problem. What are the key indicators that are going to tell us either that we're having a problem or that we've solved the problem? And just anything that really objectively quantifies what it is that can be used to set a target for improvement. These first 2 steps are just super important, and you need to test yourself along the way alongside your stakeholders and make sure that they agree on that definition and the intended outcome. If they don't agree, or if it comes back when you replay the problem that you've misunderstood it, this is the time to stop and iterate and ensure that you're on the same page. From there, you really move into step 3, which is a test and learn. And the goal here is to spend, frankly, as little time and money as possible evaluating whether one or more approaches is feasible. You're going to want to do this with a small set of users or a small batch of work, something representative as a sampling that's easy to get to that will allow you to say yay or nay whether you're hitting the mark or not. The last thing is to scale. And this is the part that's harder than it sounds. And it really should begin probably, back at step 1 or step 2 when you're doing the problem definition. Because this one involves change leadership, not just over the technology, which technology is easy, but it's also the people. Managing the people, leading this change really makes that part, the technology part, look easy. AI is a scary topic for many people, and it creates fear over things like job loss and, job security. And so, really identifying where individuals are on the change curve and bringing them along for the journey is key here in step 4. And it's equal to the technology standpoint of identifying where your technology operations are and what needs to change within them as a result of the AI that you're implementing. These are going to be new concepts that traditional IT is just not equipped to measure, act, or report on when you start talking about like bias and model drift and things like that. So this step 4, it's super critical. You're not going to be 100% accurate when you're doing this. You need to be prepared to iterate, and you need to be prepared that this isn't necessarily going to have the efficiency out of the gate that you would expect from a tech staffing or a process standpoint. You're going to have to iterate to get there.
It's a simple yet very powerful framework, right? So for our listeners, and by the way, this will be in the show notes, right? Step 1, identify the problem. Step 2, ratify metrics. Step 3, test and learn. Step 4, scale. And I think, Mike, when we were talking beforehand and even at the conference, but what happens is people get really excited about a technology and they say, we think we understand the problem. We don't really think about the metrics because we think we understand the problem. We don't need to test and learn because the solution is obvious. And then we're just going to scale. And that leads to a lot of wasted time and effort building things that nobody wants. In this case, building AI-powered products and workflows that never get adopted and don't really create any real value. And so I just loved the simplicity of the framework because it says, hey, before you kind of gallop off, into the sunset, let's just do some basic blocking and tackling up front to really make sure that this is going to create value for people before we invest a bunch of time and money delivering something that we find out isn't valuable.
That's right. I think so many of my peers and individuals in the technical segment, they get shiny object syndrome. They see something new and they want to apply it to every problem that exists. And I think shiny object syndrome, it's a great way to explore. It's a great way to learn and do some of these test and learns to see whether the tech itself is going to solve a problem that we have. But it's not the tech that we should be leading with. We should be leading with, we have this issue and here's some ways that would remediate the issue. And then is there a technology solution, AI or otherwise, that we could apply to solve for it?
I love that. Actually, another presentation that I attended at the same conference, a speaker was talking about 3 examples of where they'd used the AI. And the first example was we identified a problem and then we went in and tested an AI solution. And then the result was we decided not to use AI to solve that problem. We used another technology. And the presenter said, I chose this example first because, as you said, it's not about AI. It's about solving problems for customers, whether those are internal or external. And if AI is not the best option for solving that particular problem, please don't use it. So love the focus on customer problems.
And I think the other thing here is we're looking for like a master algorithm, so to speak. And the master algorithm just doesn't exist yet. And I think that's where our test and learns are really powerful in that they allow us to say, okay, maybe AI is the solution, But within AI, there's ensemble methods, there's deep learning, there's all of these different approaches. And your problem may actually be 7 problems stitched together. And you need to have 7 solutions that you put together as an ensemble to solve for it. So rather than leading with, oh, hey, I read about TensorFlow today, we're going to go apply that to this problem. It's more of a, hey, this is the overall workflow. These are the inefficiencies in that flow. And this particular inefficiency is one that we want to see if we can apply tech to and take a disciplined approach to solve.
So could you give us an example then of, a use case going through those 4 steps that we just talked about?
I'll tell you about one that failed. How about that? So several years ago, I was with a company and we were trying to solve a problem. We were trying to solve it in an unattended way. We wanted to get to straight through processing for a particular workflow. And we tackled it. I approached it with, this particular framework of identifying what the problem was, which was a significant amount of time processing this particular work item. I met with the business stakeholders and ratified what our metrics were in terms of accuracy and automation. What was our goal outcome? And then entered into a test and learn phase using a particular AI approach. We spent 2 to 3 sprints iterating, and our sprints were, 2 weeks piece. So we're talking about 6 weeks of time, iterating through problem. We chose a small data set within this particular workflow. And after 6 weeks, we hit 65% in terms of accuracy. And that was good enough for 6 weeks in. We were happy with that. It showed progress. We're going to say, okay, we're going to continue this for another couple of sprints. And after the next couple of sprints, it started to climb some more. We were in the low 70%. But then it stalled. We hit a roadblock where we were not able to meaningfully move the needle without breaking some other constraints that we had. And we had to take a step back and look at our error rate, our accuracy rate, and ultimately made the decision to stop. We put it on the shelf. Now, it's a failure from a standpoint of this didn't make it into production. It's really a success because number one, this was one where we learned that, you can't always go straight through with a single deep approach. Sometimes you have to break these things into smaller segments and tackle those problems with different approaches. The second thing is we didn't spend a lot of money. It was less than a program increment, which is a quarter of a year. I upskilled the team in the process of doing this. So there was a lot of success that went along with it, even though we were not able to hit that target of straight through processing. The other thing that really came out of it, and it was a learning for me, was, this will sound surprising when I say it's a learning for me, but humans make mistakes. And so when you're looking at, trying to automate a process and you're seeking this 90% accuracy or 95% accuracy in your predictions, you have to understand what you were going up against in the humans. What was the error rate for the people doing this task before we tried to automate it? And in some cases, it was 7 to 10% in terms of error rates. So looking at those things and using those as inputs to future success criteria, really, it was just a rich set of learnings that shaped my future in terms of how I approach these problems and apply the framework going forward.
It's interesting because when you lay out the 4 steps, they seem very intuitive. Of course, that's the way we would do it. But a lot of people aren't doing it that way. And, the 4 steps, again, identify problem, ratify metrics, test and learn, and then scale. The ratify metrics piece, it's hidden in plain sight here. But what you're saying is you're doing that before you do test and learn. And I think one of the things that I've seen across, many different clients and lots of different engagements and companies is that people are often reluctant to set metrics before the test and learn phase. And then that gets them into trouble later because, to your point, they say, okay, we're at 65. That's pretty good, right? We didn't set ourselves a criteria beforehand. Now we're at 72. And so I think it's a powerful idea. It's a very simple idea, but very powerful to say, what are the metrics that we need to see move and at what level do we need to achieve in order for us to continue with this? Setting that beforehand is super powerful. It's difficult because then you're kind of holding yourself accountable to hitting those metrics, but it seems to be the best practice out there.
The other hidden gem in there is it becomes a place to educate stakeholders. Back to the hype cycle, AI is not going to be 100%. Like it's a prediction. It's ultimately math equations on the back end that are predicting an outcome. And that cannot, by definition, be 100% or something else is wrong. And by setting these metrics up front, you're starting to negotiate what does success look like. And if you have a stakeholder that has the wrong expectations, it allows you to do that negotiation before you spend a dime on the problem, and really moves the needle in terms of alignment and engagement going forward. You're building the trust out of the gate. And when you have that as a foundation, it makes the uncertainty of the outcomes much more palatable, that much more of a trusted conversation in the end that you're having versus you get to the end, you're at 75%. And I'm like, what? So the more you can tease that out up front and educate up front, the better off you'll be on the back end.
I think another component is sometimes teams think that their job is to move something forward no matter what. And by setting metrics that say, hey, this opportunity would need to achieve this level on these metrics beforehand. And if it can't, then it's not a good investment opportunity for our company and we should go to the next thing in backlog. It takes a little bit of the kind of the ego or the, hey, I'm not doing my job, the sentiment from the team. If it doesn't hit those metrics, they just say, okay, this obviously was a weaker use case. And so we'll just go on to the next thing, as opposed to taking it personally that their personal project got canceled.
For sure. And this is technology imitating other decision criteria in other industries. You wouldn't build a house without having certain criteria for the concrete foundation going in. And then you want someone to inspect it and make sure the foundation's right. And if it's not, you want to stop and fix it or maybe abandon the job site. So I think this is us in IT and in technology holding ourselves to a more rigorous set of objective outcomes that we can measure ourselves by and really make sure that we're driving toward the value that we can provide. I think most of the listeners to this podcast can probably sympathize with being on a project at some point where I don't know why we're doing it. I don't know what it's going to look like when we get there. Maybe even thinking, gosh, this thing's going to fail, but there's no objective way to say that. They have this feeling and maybe they get there and they're right. It failed. So the more crisp you can be with objectives, metrics, how are we going to measure this along the way? I think the more engaged of a delivery team, the more engaged of a business team that you get. And it becomes a little bit more palatable if, to your point, hey, we didn't quite hit these, must not have been the best use case. Let's take everything we learned and go tackle the next problem.
In addition, what's success and what's failure? To your point, if you spend a quarter of a year working on something to find out that you shouldn't invest in it anymore, is that really a failure? Or is that a learning that you can bank and say, okay, now we know what to do better next time? So I'm familiar with quite a few cases where companies have spent 2 years and $10 million building up a use case. And now they're finding that nobody's adopting it, nobody's using it. And so those executives are really nervous because they spent all that time and money and they haven't created value for it. That's more of a failure than spending 3 months to find out we shouldn't do something for maybe, 5 figures as opposed to spending 2 years and $10 million and then finding out exactly the same thing.
What you just shared, it's a really key takeaway for your listeners today is you may have money thrown at you right now because of the hype cycle. Generative AI is going to leave people in the dust. And so, okay, now the executives are throwing money at different generative AI use cases. And the money may be easy to get today, But a year from now, 18 months from now, they're going to come back and say, what did I get for it? And if you didn't set yourself up with these measures along the way, you're either going to have a raging success and it'll be an easy story to tell, or you could have success and a very hard story to tell because you don't know what the baseline was. You don't know really what the numbers were before. So you may have a good outcome, but you can't tell the story, or you may have poor outcome and no story to go with it. And I guess there's a fourth, there's a poor outcome and you have the metrics along the way to show how you got to that poor outcome. But at some point, finance always comes back and says, what did we get for $10 million over 2 years? And you need to be able to answer it. And this basic set of steps will help capture that along the way and make that story one that's easier for you to share.
It's such an important point. Finance always comes back. And so we've seen cases where, and by the way, it's not just AI, it was blockchain, or it was 3D printing, or it was drones, or even just kind of corporate innovation in general. There's the hype cycle where people are really excited and money is easy. But to your point, the budget man comes knocking eventually and says, hey, we've been giving you this money. What have we gotten for it so that we can justify doing this again next year? And if you haven't provided some wins or some metrics, a path towards value, getting budget for the next fiscal year is incredibly difficult.
Yeah. One tip or trick I can share in here, thinking about like test and learn phase, sometimes it's really hard to quantify what the outcome is because you almost need a parallel universe in which you did not make the change in order to know how it would have played out. And to me, that's the power of that test and learn. It allows you to operate with a smaller set in parallel, potentially even in stealth mode, where you can do kind of an A/B type of test and apply AI to one set and then allow the normal process to flow for the other set and then get that comparison. So you can use that in test and learn as you collect metrics. You can use it in scale. As you've signed off on it, you're now going into scale. You could apply this same type of A/B approach in there and use that to collect the metrics. Because sometimes that's really hard to say, here's what it would have been if we hadn't done it. How do you know? I don't know because, the work changes day to day. If you do it in parallel, it allows you to have that alternate universe and really, collect what that would have looked like.
So when you're talking about test and learn, which is the third step in your 4-step framework, does that mean just testing the model itself, or does that mean with testing with users or customers as well?
Yeah. So it really could be both. It depends on the metric and what you're trying to accomplish as to how deep you go and what level of involvement you have. When you are attempting to do straight through processing or something of a workflow, maybe your A test is peeling off the exact same work items that's going through the normal flow and applying AI to it, testing your model, looking at the outputs, and then comparing your result to what the regular flow would say. That's one great way to go through a test and learn. In some other cases, you are doing something assistive. And if it's assistive to the human, then yes, at some point, you're going to have to bring, a subset of users in, kind of coach them up on what you're trying to accomplish, how this is going to improve their life, and then ultimately introduce them to the capability that you're building, do some of that change leadership with them, and then ultimately run those work items through and kind of compare the before and after. In both those cases, if you can do an A/B where you've got a control group and you've got the group that's using the model, that's the holy grail. That is in parallel, your ability to show how you're progressing against the metrics, how you're moving the KPI needles, and give you the confidence that, yes, what we just did in small scale, it proves out. Let's move this to full scale.
And it's a great way of looking at a funnel of use cases and saying, okay, we've got all these ideas in our test and learn phase. What are we finding that are actually affecting those metrics that we set ahead of time? and we can weed out the weaker use cases, not saying they're necessarily bad, but they're just weaker, and really identify the strongest use cases to then push into scale.
It also helps tease out some bad assumptions you made along the way. There are over the years, there are groups that I've worked with that the process was actually in people's heads. There was no process map. There was nothing that laid out really what it looked like end to end. And it allowed, the employees to make their own decisions along the way. And the second that's happening and you're straying away from some sort of, standard operating procedure or whatever, harder it's going to be to apply tech to make the change. You've introduced a human variable of decisioning that maybe you weren't aware of. If you're going straight through, a little bit easier because you're bypassing some of that human decisioning and you're training your model on something that had human decisioning in it. So you're likely getting a lift of building an AI model that's capturing some of that tacit knowledge. That's a great thing. But where you have distilled some of these processes and you're being assistive, it really relies on knowing what it is you're assisting. And if they're deviating from what you're expecting, chaos can happen. I mean, that's probably the simplest way of saying it.
Yeah, it's hard to automate something that isn't a process to begin with. So, Mike, we just went through a use case example where you defined problems and metrics up front, and then you went to test and learn and found, you know what, this is a weaker use case. We're going to park this opportunity. Could you give us an example of an opportunity or use case that actually made it all the way through to scale?
That last step of moving into scale is really about three main things. So one is operationalizing the models and the technology to take on the use case, the overall business problem that we're solving for. And that's fairly straightforward from a technology standpoint. It's putting the machinery in place, it's provisioning compute, things of that nature, not unlike other IT initiatives that are going into a production mode. The second piece, not exactly unlike other initiatives, it's doing the change leadership with the people who are on the receiving end or experiencing the business problem. This is super challenging. It's ultimately the adoption play. Earlier we talked about the users who, maybe it's an assistive technology for them. And in cases, the process was in their head or some of the process was up to their own discretion. And so now you're bringing in an assistive technology and asking them to do it in a particular way that may differ from what they think is best. Why is Mike and his team coming in telling us how to run this operation? And that's where, you've got to have your relationships with your business stakeholders. You've got to have a rich change leadership program in place to assess where the individuals are in terms of their knowledge, their receptiveness to change, and ultimately applying those change management principles to target, their individual needs and get them into a place of acceptance for it. The third piece, and the one that goes back to step two, it's near and dear to my heart, is putting that dashboard in place where you can see, are you getting the benefit that you expected? You go back to those metrics that we agreed upon. They may have changed. Like when you do the test and learn, there could be hidden gems in there. Find out, the reality is, this is a more important KPI and this one's not. And maybe we need to change our targets. But then putting those in a place where the technology teams, the business teams, and the other stakeholders, like finance may be a stakeholder that wants to see what the performance of certain models are. Your overarching risk and control group, legal, like they may want to see instrumentation around model bias and model drift. And so building this dashboard that can, in near real-time basis, show what this technology is doing, how it's performing, and giving that visibility to all of those stakeholders, it's super critical. And, it's potentially one of the hardest parts of scaling is getting that data in a way that's consumable, that really it addresses all the different information needs of the different stakeholders so that everyone's comfortable with what you have advanced into production.
This is great. And by the way, I really appreciate the way that you simplify things. It's obviously more complicated than a 4-step framework, but you've simplified it into a 4-step framework. And then in scale, you're saying, hey, here are the 3 kind of critical elements to think about in scale. That's just great for listeners because most people are on the treadmill and aren't able to take notes and digest all this. And so I really appreciate the way you're kind of breaking all this down. So Mike, I love the 3 elements of scale. The first one being operational or IT plan. The second one being change management with the humans that are involved. And then number 3 is setting up an impact dashboard to make sure you're really getting the value. Based on your interaction with other AI leaders in this space, including at the conference that we're both at, do you feel like these 3 areas are being systematically addressed across the board at most companies?
The key phrase in there is at most companies. And I think to some extent, we're all pushing on those 3 levers. We're at different levels of adoption, awareness, and really maturity on those facets. If I were to hone in on one that has the most variance in it, it is the change leadership. It's driving adoption with the humans that are in the loop. And that's not unlike other initiatives in IT. There are numerous examples of beautiful systems that are built and put on the shelf because the right level of change and adoption could not be driven. I think here it's more acute because AI is seen as, frankly, a threat. So you have this added facet, if you will, not just of needing to change a process or impact to a workflow. Now you have people on the receiving end of it who have that fear of their job being replaced by it. And that's one that every organization is going to have their own general approach to addressing and helping people through the change curve. But I think it's probably the biggest speed bump when you're trying to scale a solution is to deal with that human element in a way that gets the business outcome you're driving for while having empathy toward the individuals who are on the receiving end of the change.
So Mike, unfortunately, we're almost out of time. This podcast is for corporate AI executives such as yourself. So if you could give just a few key pieces of advice to your fellow corporate AI executives, what would those be?
I think if you take away 2 key things, it would be this. The first is ground yourself in the basics of solving business problems. That's what those 4 steps are all about. Identify the problem, identify the metrics to success, test and learn your solution against those metrics, and where you're hitting the mark, scale it. That's basic blocking and tackling that will set you up for success in your initiatives and be able to tell the story of where did the pile of money go when finance comes back. I think the second key thing, and maybe even more important, is to realize that educating others is part of this gig. There is too much hype in AI today that's leading to expectations that do not match reality. Back to step 2 of my framework of ratify metrics, that's all about identifying the places where your stakeholders have a different expectation than what reality will bring. That's my simple way of doing it. But just in your day-to-day interactions, when you're working with other executives, when you're talking to the CEO, know that big consulting firms are in there promising big gains, and the knowledge gap between the gain and how we get there is significant, across these stakeholder groups. And so educating them and bringing them to that same level of expectation and reality is really, one of the key parts of your job.
Very succinct, very powerful. So Mike, I think embedded in your approach is the fact that not all of these use cases should be scaled. So just looking at the framework, it's identify problems, identify metrics, test and learn, and then scale. But not everything makes it to scale. And I think that's because we're uncertain about what should be scaled in the first place. And I think there's a lot of pressure to know ahead of time what we should scale and just kind of pick the winners up front and then execute them, as opposed to taking a little bit of time to say, look, we don't know. Let's admit that we don't know exactly which use cases are going to be successful. So let's have a small yet efficient process up front to test and learn and really identify the stronger use cases and take those, weeding out the weaker ones. What are your thoughts on that?
100%. And it's not a one size fits all approach within an enterprise of how you do that. It's super important to really explore what the different opportunities are, what the potential outcomes are. There are going to be certain use cases that you can look at and say, wow, if we did that, we're going to save millions in OpEx, or we're going to generate millions in revenue by doing Y. And those are the ones that will get the more immediate attention to get an understanding of, okay, how can we exploit some of this technology to get those? Really, there's countless others that you need to have kind of that culture of exploration where different teams can be looking at these problems, doing some experiments, doing quick test and learns to say, yeah, this looks good or it doesn't. And that may mean having an entire innovation group that's not accountable for delivery and does this exploration. And when they find a winner, they hand it off to be exploited. So the number of problems that exist are infinite. The ones that have the most fruit attached to them are generally obvious. It's the ones that are right below the surface that I think, having that culture of exploration and having it almost democratized across different teams to where, the ones closest to it can experiment. I think that's the type of organization that's really going to be poised to capitalize in the future.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Lean AI podcast. We hope you found our conversation with Mike Schubert as insightful and inspiring as we did. Remember, the true power of AI lies not just in the technology itself, but in how we as leaders integrate it into our organizations to drive meaningful change. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe to the Lean AI podcast on your favorite platform and leave us a review. For more resources, insights, and tools discussed in today's episode, visit our website at www.leanstartup.co. And don't forget to follow us on social media for the latest updates and exclusive content. Thank you once again for joining us. Until next time, stay innovative and keep pushing the boundaries of what AI can achieve in your organization. The Lean AI podcast is brought to you by Lean Startup Co. To find out more about our Lean AI approach to generating more AI wins with far less wasted time and investment, including our training workshops, pilot programs, and full implementation offerings, visit us at www.leanstartup.co. Search the Lean AI podcast in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts, and make sure to click subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. On behalf of the team here at Lean Startup Co., thanks for listening and sharing with your colleagues and friends if you found this episode insightful.